This playlist collects together and organizes the individual component modules, which together will comprise our lecture on Alvin Goldman's paper, The Internalist Conception of Justification. We'll begin the lecture in the same way that Alvin begins the paper itself, by introducing the distinction between a theoretical and a regulative notion of justification, as well as the concept of doxastic voluntarism. Alvin will use these to frame the way he wants us to think about issues within this paper, and specifically how he wants us to understand the internalist project itself. And in fact, our lecture structure will hew fairly closely to the structure of Alvin's paper throughout. Then we'll turn to his general thesis in this paper. That thesis has two components. It has a negative component, which takes up the vast majority of the paper, and then it has a positive component that he introduces towards the end. We'll specify his negative thesis, including how he outlines the internalist project as he conceives of it, and then how the negative thesis applies to that internalist project as he understands it. We'll see how he argues against the internalist project by giving a series of possible criterion for how that project could be realized, and rejecting all of those criterion as either indefinite or unacceptable criteria. And then finally we'll end, as he ends the paper, by looking at his positive claim that much of what the internalist conception strives towards can be accomplished within the externalist conception of justification. So let's turn our attention to the first part of this lecture. As I say, we'll begin with some preliminaries, and specifically, we'll talk about this distinction that he makes at the very beginning of the paper between regulative and theoretical conceptions of justification. We'll look at the claim that he makes that internalists conflate regulative with theoretical notions of justification. And then we'll look at this notion of doxastic voluntarism, this idea that no matter what the evidence is, there's always a component of free choice as to whether or not one believes or disbelieves something given that evidence. And finally, we'll introduce this notion that he uses throughout the paper of a doxastic decision principle, a series of principles that would specify how to go about making systematic and well-founded decisions if one accepts doxastic voluntarism and one pursues the internalist regulative notion of justification. And we'll end by talking about his general thesis. So let's start then with this distinction between the regulative and theoretical notions of justification that he introduces. For Alvin, the regulative notion of justification is a prescriptive notion. It is a set of rules or guidelines which shape how we make our choices about whether or not to believe things given particular evidential situations, so that we are more likely to believe things that are justified and less likely to believe things that are not. And so he tells us that that notion of justification guides belief formation so as to facilitate one's forming beliefs in ways that make them likely to be justified. Now he contrasts this notion with the theoretical notion of justification. And the theoretical notion of justification tells us why any given belief is in fact justified. Now, to clarify the distinction between these, he points out that it's important for us to note that theoretical principles may not effectively guide action, despite revealing the nature of justification. So we may have a theoretical understanding of what it is to be justified in a particular circumstance, but that in and of itself may not tell us how to go about accomplishing that goal of having a justified belief. Regulative principles, he thinks, in a similar fashion, may not provide insight into justification, despite giving us reasons or rules for how to go about conducting our epistemic activities. He suggests that many epistemologists have conflated these two notions, the theoretical and the regulative notion, so that they think that by offering a theoretical or a regulative theory of justification, they have in fact given both types of accounts. While this is logically possible, Alvin wants to emphasize that it is not necessary, that it is quite possible that our theoretical notion will not provide us with a regulative notion, and our regulative notion will not provide us with a theoretical notion. To illustrate this point, we can think about a regulative notion of religious practice according to the Hindu religion. So in general, according to the Hindu religion, right living includes worshiping God or gods, doing good works, going on pilgrimages to holy places, learning through meditation, yoga, and with the help of a master. Now, all of these things specify a regulative notion of religious practice. However, in themselves, these recommendations don't explain the underlying goal or value of religious practice. And that is the distinction that Alvin wants to point to. He wants to point to this idea that we can have a notion about why we act, what makes our acts evaluatively good or bad, that is based upon whether or not they conform to a set of principles that help us to accomplish a particular goal. Those principles can be articulated in a way that doesn't actually specify what the goal is. Conversely, we can have a specification of a goal without having any insight into how that goal can be accomplished. Now, he points out that it's difficult for one to adopt a regulative notion of justification if one doesn't, at least to some degree, accept some sort of doxastic voluntarism. The idea that a cognizer or a reasoner can choose to believe something based upon some bit of evidence at a given time. That is, it's possible for them to assent or to withhold assent, just as Descartes thinks you can most of the time. And Alvin says if you don't buy into that notion, then it's difficult for you to find the regulative notion of justification plausible. But he says, look, if we accept doxastic voluntarism, or at least some sort of compatibilism about our abilities, so that even if we are determined to form beliefs given particular sets of evidence in a way that doesn't really introduce a notion of uncaused freedom, but we can still make sense of choices that are principled and conform to a principle of sufficient reason, then we can look at ways for understanding our regulative notion. And the suggestion that he makes is that the regulative notion is spelled out in terms of a set of doxastic decision principles, or DDPs. We begin, he says, by noting that a DDP will be a rule that specifies a relationship between inputs, initial conditions, initial information available to us, and outputs, resulting doxastic states, prescriptions about the adoption or retention of particular doxastic attitudes. So there's this set of rules, this set of decision principles that tells us or guides us in how we make our decisions. And Alvin's contention will be that there is no such plausible internalist account of what a right set of doxastic decision principles would amount to. In the next lecture module, we'll turn our attention to how Goldman specifically formulates the internalist position within this general framework, and then how he articulates his negative thesis with regard to the internalist position.